I'm Dave Kalland. I'm president of Stoughton Historical Society. It is November 7th, 2015, and I'll be telling a few stories about Stoughton, and we'll be looking at the artifacts inside the Stoughton Museum, which is right behind me at 324 South Page. The museum, the building, that's the first church built in Stoughton in 1858. It was the first Universalist church, and Luke Stoughton, the founder of Stoughton, donated the property for the church at this location, and he was also a member here. The church was built for $2,100 in 1858. And the foundation was dug with a team of oxen and a plow for the foundation. The cream-colored bricks came from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They would take a team of oxen and a wagon to Milwaukee and haul the bricks back. And it would be at least a 2-week journey, depending on the weather. But if the weather was good, it'd be 2 weeks. But if the weather was rainy and the roads were muddy, it'd take longer than 2 weeks. Now we can get to Milwaukee in a little over an hour, about an hour. The Universalist congregation disbanded and offered the building as a museum to the Stoughton community. So some of the local business owners got together and formed the Stoughton Historical Society in 1960, and we opened to the public in 1962. The first weekend we were open, we had about 1,100 people come through the museum. But now when we're open, we only maybe get 3 people at the most, 3 visitors visiting the museum. The bell is still up in the bell tower on top of the museum. It's a big cast iron bell. It's probably about 4 foot across, 3 or 4 foot across. The rope still hangs down from the bell in the entryway, but we do not ring the bell because it's been a couple of years since I've been up there to examine it, make sure everything's okay. It's quite difficult to get up through the scuttle hole and need at least a 28-foot ladder to get up there. Before we go inside, I'll mention across the street is the Sons of Norway Lodge. That was the Norwegian Methodist Church, and the Sons of Norway bought the building in 1970 and made it their lodge. And they have many activities there. And just next to the lodge, corner of Main Street and Page Street, is our new Norwegian Heritage Center that just opened in May of 2015. And before we go inside, I'll mention that the base of our flag over on the left here is a grinding stone from the grist mill that was in Stoughton down at the mill pond. The grist mill would grind wheat, barley, oats, and make flour for baking. And there'd be 2 stones. They're about this big around, probably about 3 foot across. And they have grooves in them, and be 2 stones side by side going in opposite directions, and that would grind the oats or wheat into fine pellets, so you could use it for other purposes. Also across the street, there's a walking bridge. There's a wide sidewalk that comes from Page Street down to the river. And there's a walking bridge there. In the houses down there, it's called Peteville, because Pete Hagen built those houses down there, and most everybody that lived in the houses worked at the wagon works, which is where Uniroyal is now, along the mill pond. And he built the walking bridge so the employees didn't have to walk all the way down to Main Street and back up again to get to work. This way they could walk right across the bridge. 4 or 5 years ago, there's a semi-tractor that drove across the bridge. The fella had just gotten a job driving semi for Stone Trailers, and he was celebrating, and he was not from the area. And he took his semi-tractor and drove across the bridge and came up the hill to Page Street. To his surprise, that it was blocked off. He could not get out on Page Street. So he had to back the semi-tractor back down the hill, and when he got to the bottom of the hill, the Stoughton police were waiting for him, and they arrested him for being intoxicated and driving. The first schoolhouse in Stoughton was built down on the northwest corner of Main and Page Street. That was the first public school. And on the northeast corner was a Baptist church. I'm not sure when the Baptist church disappeared. It was before my time. So we'll go inside now and look at some artifacts inside, and I'll tell you some more stories. We are now inside the entranceway of the museum, and on the wall on the left is all the different wallpaper that was on the walls here that was removed before the walls were painted. There's 8 different patterns, and we just had the interior painted about 3 years ago, and the exterior was painted this summer. And up on the wall across from me is a bald eagle that was shot up at Kalland Point at Lake Eganza back in 1903. That's before they were protected. It was legal to shoot them, and it's a young bald eagle. That's why it does not have a white head. And we'll move in here, and in the display case here, we have a tall ship, which is typical of the type of ships that the first immigrants came from Norway to America. And it would take them 10 to 12 weeks in good weather if they didn't run into a big storm. But sometimes it would take them 18 to 20 weeks. And the passengers were not allowed up on deck. They had to stay down in the hold underneath the deck the whole journey. And each passenger was allowed 1 quart of water a day per person. They could use it to wash up with or drink, or if you spilled it, you were not given any more water. And of course there was no refrigeration, and everybody brought their own food with them. So as far as food, no way of keeping it from going bad. So it was dried cod or flatbread or something like what we know as beef jerky now to chew on. And there's one fellow that came over, Andrew Severson, longtime resident of Stoughton. He came over as a young lad with his mother, and they ended up in Chicago, and his mother became ill, and his mother was hauled away on a wagon pulled by horses, and Andrew ran after the wagon trying to keep up, and he could not keep up. So he never saw his mother again, and he befriended a street person in Chicago, and that street person introduced Andrew to a minister down there. And the minister knew about our children's home or orphanage here in Stoughton, just north of Stoughton, Martin Luther Orphanage, or Martin Luther Children's Home. So the minister sent Andrew up here to the Martin Luther Orphanage, and that's where Andrew lived till he was old enough to get out on his own, probably at age 16 or 17. We have some trunks here, and if you notice, this one has a rounded top, and some of them have a flat top. But the reason they started making rounded top trunks is they discovered that when they came over here on the ships, that the rounded top trunks were near the top of the pile, so it's easier for them to get at their belongings, because it's a little kind of difficult to stack anything on top of a rounded top trunk. So there's those that had the round tops, their trunks were near the top of the pile coming over. And if you want to know a lot about Stoughton and the Stoughton area, we got a book called Oak Opening that is very good. It tells about when they surveyed the land in this area, the townships, like Stoughton is in a Dunkirk township. Then you got Pleasant Springs, Rutland, and Dunn. But it goes back to when the area was surveyed, and it tells about Luke Stoughton, the founder of Stoughton. And also there's a story in there about one of the first white settlers in this area by the name of Abel Rasdall. He was a fur trader, and he lived north of Stoughton on Williams Drive, where the old Buffalo Ranch is now. And the Buffalo Ranch would be across this road from La Follette Park. When I was growing up, La Follette Park was called NYA Park, which is National Youth Administration, which was a group of, it was a program where 16 to 20, I think 21-year-olds could work and get paid a little bit. And that's how the park was developed out there by the NYA group. And that's similar to the CCC, the Civilian Conservation, and the WPA, which is Work Progress Administration. So if you want to know more about the Stoughton area in little history, I suggest buying an oak opening. We have them for sale at the museum here and down at the chamber office at the railroad depot. They're $15 a piece. But Mr. Rasdall, he married an Indian woman who was already married to an Indian, and when her Indian husband found out, supposedly he bit her nose off. So from that day forward till she passed away, she wore a scarf around her face to cover up that she didn't have any nose. And she died of smallpox. Well, then Abel, he remarried and had some children. But he was quite a fur trader. Indians didn't know the value of the furs, so he would just have some cheap trinkets or something and trade for a beaver hide that might have been worth $5 back then. That was back before around 1845, 46, I suppose. And we'll go into the other room here. And in this first cubicle here is a display for Per Listney. He's credited with introducing rose malling to America. And his picture is up on the mantle there. He emigrated to Stoughton at age 26 from Norway. And he worked at the wagon works as a pinstriper. And the pinstriper is the man or the person that would paint a thin pinstripe around the wooden wagon wheels and on each spoke. And he would also rose maul the sideboards for the wagons and the buggies and whatever else they made. They made manure spreaders also. But Per Listney is credited with introducing rose malling to America. He lived over on Summit Avenue, just south of Riverside Cemetery, or southeast. And when he did rose malling, he was in his garage. And he would let people watch him if they wanted to, but they could not say anything. They couldn't talk. If they talked, he would kick them out. But he rose mauled all these plates except the far corner one. That was rose mauled by Per Listney's daughter-in-law. And there's a plate, the upper one on the left, that was by Harold Harrison. Otherwise, all of the others he painted. And when there wasn't any work at the wagon works, Per would hire out to rose maul kitchen cupboard doors or walls, and he would stay right with the family till the project was done. But he would go to Iowa, Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, and paint cupboards or doors in the house, whatever they wanted painted. And here's an article about some doors that he did paint. And we have some down at Luke Stoughton House in storage also, some doors that he painted. And we'll move on around the corner here. We got our Native American display, Indian display. We have many arrowheads that were found in the Stoughton and Utica area. The There was Menominee Indian tribe here, and the arrowheads were found along Catfish Creek, which is now called Yahara River. And Yahara means catfish in Menominee language. And we have some beautiful beadwork and a peace pipe in the display case here, and some stones that was used for axes or hatchets. And under the display case we got some Native American snowshoes and some grinding stones. And above the display case on the wall there's an oar that was found in a boathouse up here at Lake Eganza. It was a homemade oar used for rowing a boat. And we'll come over to our military display. We have our military display in the display case, and above it on the wall here, in the display case, we got a gas mask from World War I and some German helmets, and got a weapon in there. I'm not sure what model it is, but you do not call them guns. If you're in the military, you're trained that it's called a weapon, not a gun. And we got some plaques here. These are photos of the plaques on the Stoughton Library wall of those that were killed in battle or conflicts. This is Stoughton area people that were killed. This is for World War I. This is World War II. And here we got Korea and Vietnam. And also we got Stoughton service roll of the Stoughton veterans that were in World War I. In this particular, it's like a billboard. It was located between the City Hall and the Coffee Cup restaurant on the west side of the City Hall where the parking lot is. And there's also a Stoughton service roll board for World War II, and that was located in the 200 block of East Main, about where the post office is now, on the south side of East Main. And we got a Civil War uniform in the display case also, and there's a bugle in there also. And on the other side we got some Confederate money up here in the picture frame. And here's a picture of the Stoughton Civil War vets that belong to the GAR, which is Grand Army of the Republic. It was for the Civil War veterans only, and it was started in 1866 down at Decatur, Illinois, and it was in existence till 1965 when the last Civil War veteran passed away up in Minnesota. And here we have some World War II medals and World War I picture. And getting away from the military items before we get too far along, in this picture frame we have a newspaper printed in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1863. But what's so neat about it, it's printed on wallpaper. There's a depression just like in the 20s and 30s, and paper was not readily available, so they used wallpaper to print this particular newspaper from Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1863. And we got some more military items in the display case from the Civil War. There's a wooden canteen here, and underneath the display case we got the drum that was used by one of the units in Civil War. And I'm sure just about everybody has been to a military funeral where they play the taps, or been to some program where taps are played. And we have a explanation of how taps started. I will read it to you. And it all began in 1862 during the Civil War, when Union Army Captain Robert Ellicombe was with his men near Harrison's Landing in Virginia. The Confederate Army was on the other side of the narrow strip of land. During the night, Captain Ellicombe heard the moans of a soldier who lay severely wounded on the field. Not knowing if it was a Union or Confederate soldier, the captain decided to risk his life and bring the stricken man back for medical attention. Crawling on his stomach through the gunfire, the captain reached the stricken soldier and began pulling him toward his encampment. When the captain finally reached his own lines, he discovered it was actually a Confederate soldier, but the soldier was dead. The captain lit a lantern and suddenly caught his breath and went numb with shock. In the dim light, he saw the face of the soldier. It was his own son. The boy had been studying music in the South when the war broke out, and without telling his father, the boy enlisted in the Confederate Army. The following morning, heartbroken, the father asked permission of his superiors to give his son a full military burial, despite his enemy status. His request was only partially granted. The captain had asked if he could have a group of Army band members play a funeral dirge for his son at the funeral. The request was turned down since the soldier was a Confederate. But out of respect for the father, they did say they could give him only one musician. The captain chose a bugler. He asked the bugler to play a series of musical notes he had found on a piece of paper in the pocket of the dead youth's uniform. This wish was granted. The haunting melody we know now as taps, used at military funerals, was born. And there are also words to it. The words are, "Day is done, gone the sun, from the lakes, from the hills, from the sky, all is well. Safely rest, God is nigh. Fading light dims the sight, and a star gems the sky. Gleaming bright from afar, drawing nigh, falls the night. Thanks and praise for our days neath the sun, neath the stars. Neath the sky as we go, this we know, God is nigh." And I too have felt the chills while listening to taps, but I have never seen all the words to the song until now. I didn't even know there was more than one verse. I also never knew the story behind the song, and I didn't know if you had either, so I thought I'd pass it on along. I now have even deeper respect for the song than I did before. Remember those lost and harmed while serving their country. Also remember those who have served and given their all. So that's how TAPS was, one of the stories how TAPS began. And also, if you've been to a cemetery, you might have seen some coins on a tombstone, and that has significance too. A coin left on a headstone lets the deceased soldier's family know that somebody stopped by to pay their respect. Leaving a penny means you visited. A nickel means that you and the deceased soldier trained at boot camp together. If you served with a soldier, you leave a dime. A quarter is a very significant because it means that you were there when that soldier died. So that's when you go to the cemetery and see some coins on a gravestone, you will know what the meaning is of it. We'll move on to some other displays here. We got our military uniforms. We got World War I Army uniform. We got World War I Red Cross uniform. World War II Army uniform. All these uniforms are worn by Stoughton residents. And here's Vi Owen's World War II uniform. And she would come and get her uniform every year for Memorial Day, the Memorial Day program, and wear her uniform. She did that till she passed away. And again, some more World War II uniforms. And got a Navy uniform hanging from the light. and woman's Navy uniform. We got Air Force uniform, and down in the far corner got my fatigues when I was in the Vietnam era. I was in Vietnam part of 1970 and 71. Those fatigues are not the fatigues we wore in Vietnam, but we wore those fatigues in the States before I went to Nam. I was in the 1st of the 5th Cav Army unit, and I'm not really sure where I was at in Vietnam. I know it was north of Saigon, but about every 4 or 5 weeks we would move. We'd hop on a chopper and fly a distance, and they'd drop us at another fire base. I was at Fire Base Mace and Fire Base Nancy. I was outside of Phuc Vinh and at Quan Loy, and I was at some other fire bases too, which I don't recall all the names of them. But by the time we got all set up, then we'd have to move on again. Up on the wall here is a World War II bond poster. It's a last bond poster of World War II. They would sell war bonds to help finance the war. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that the second guy right here is John Bradley from Antigo, Wisconsin. And if you have read or seen the movie Flags of Our Fathers, that is about John Bradley at Iwo Jima. And I've read the book. I have the book of Flags of Our Fathers, and it sounds very similar to what we encountered in Vietnam. The Japanese were dug into the mountain there, and they would pop up and fire at their enemy and hide again, and you never knew where the rounds were coming from. In Vietnam, it was very similar. The Viet Cong or North Vietnamese would pop up out of what's called spider holes. They just pop their head up and fire off a few rounds and disappear again. And in the jungle, you didn't have any idea where it's coming from. And when you secured an area, they had spider holes in Vietnam. There was a fellow, or more than one fellow, there's a few guys that were called tunnel rats. And they had to go down in the spider holes and through the tunnels to make sure that there weren't any Viet Cong or North Vietnamese hiding in there. And the spider holes were just big enough for a body to get down in there, and they would go down head first. And of course, if there is a enemy down there, they're sitting there waiting for you. As soon as your head appears, they would shoot your head off. But if there weren't any there, if you happen to luck out, you get down in there, then there'd be a berm you'd have to crawl up over. And again, the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese might be down the tunnel a little ways waiting for you to stick your head up over that berm. Or it could be booby trap. They'd have tripwires there with explosives, and it'd be like fish line or thread for sewing. You couldn't see it very easy at all, especially in the dark. You wouldn't see it at all down there. And you'd hit the tripwire and you bit the dust. You're done. But anyway, out in Washington, D.C., down at Clinton, Wisconsin, the high school, every year the senior class takes a senior trip out to Washington, D.C. About 2 years ago, they were getting off the bus at the Iwo Jima Memorial. And there's a fellow sitting by the memorial, and the fellow asked the kids as they were getting off the bus, "Where are you from?" And the kid says, "Wisconsin." And the guy says, "Oh, a bunch of cheeseheads, huh?" Because we got the nickname of cheeseheads. And the kid said, "Yeah." Well, the fellow that asked him the question said, "Well, I'm a cheesehead too. I'm from Antigo, Wisconsin." Well, come to find out, it was John Bradley's son, Jim Bradley, that was sitting there. So they got a very good explanation and an account of what his dad went through at Iwo Jima. And on the memorial in D.C., there's 13 hands on the flagpole, but there's only 6 guys. So one of the students asked, well, how come there's 13 hands? Should only be 12. Jim Bradley says, the architect or the sculptor put the 13th hand on there for the hand of God, for all the hell that they went through at Iwo Jima and all the other conflicts in World War II and World War I, Civil War. So the 13th hand of the word is the hand of God. Over on the other side here, we got some more military display, got some more weapons. Again, they are not called guns, they're called weapons. And in basic training, at least when I was in basic training, if you did call it a gun, you had to do about 50 push-ups. And after you did that 2 or 3 times, you remember it's not a gun, it is a weapon. And we have some swords in there, and again, a canteen. And in this 3-ring binder, we got some letters from Stoughton residents who was in the Civil War. His name is John Hunt. He died at a POW camp. I don't remember where. It's been a while since I've read these letters, but it does say in here. And there's a couple pictures of a high chair that he made before he went into the Civil War. And 2 of our members of the Stoughton Historical Society are relatives of John Hunt, and they still have this high chair. So it's a great remembrance for them, having the high chair that he made before he went into the Civil War. Again, this was a church, and it's built in Greek Revival. If you're outside and look at the front of the church from Page Street, the left half of the church is a mirror image of the right half. That's in the Greek Revival architect. And there's also 2 doors, one on each side, entering the church. And the men would enter in the right-hand door, and the women and children left-hand door, and they would sit separately in the church. And at that time, it was thought that the men were superior to the women, so that's why they sat separately. But I got my own theory of that. That way, my theory, which is, of course, not correct, but I figured that way the men could doze off during the sermon and the wives weren't next to them, poking them to keep them awake. Just a little humor there. And the light hanging from the ceiling is original to this church. And also, up in the corner, we have a pump organ that's original to the church. It needs some repair. I think some of the bellows leak. It's so old that they rotted out. And also, there's 3 chairs along the back wall that are from this church, in the pulpit stand and the church pew. You could buy church pews, and that was your pew to sit in every Sunday. Everybody went to church on Sunday, not like it is nowadays. Not too many people attend church anymore. But that was the thing to do for one to come to church, and that way you got to socialize with the local people. Luke Stoughton had 4 church pews right up in the front of the church here, and they were $100 a piece. And as you went towards the back of the church, they became cheaper. But he had 4 of them right at the front. He must have been quite a wealthy man. His trade was a mechanic. He was a Yankee from Weatherfield, Vermont. And times were tough out east. Couldn't get enough food, and there wasn't much work. And that's also why the immigrants came to America, because no food and no work in Norway or Denmark or wherever they came from. So they came to America to better themselves. But Luke, he came to the Midwest to better himself. Originally, he bought a farm about 7 miles south of Edgerton. So between Edgerton and Janesville, he bought a farm, and he lived there for 2 years. And his wife, Eliza Page, that's how we got Page Street out front. didn't like being on the farm. She was afraid of the Indians. So Luke sold the farm and moved into a small community called Janesville, Wisconsin. And there he started a mercantile business and real estate business. So he was wandering around the area, and he came upon the property along the Catfish Creek, which is now Yahara River. And he liked the property here, and because he had water power for powering a grist mill, lumber mill, or whatever. And so he bought 800 acres for $2.60. And at that time, quite often you'd have to go to Milwaukee or Green Bay to sign the papers and make the deal on buying land. So if you bought land, if you had a horse, you'd ride the horse. Otherwise, you would walk to either Milwaukee or Green Bay to make the land transaction. So he bought 800 acres for $2.60, and the first building he put up was a sawmill on the river by the mill pond, because he figured there was lots of lumber here, and so cut the trees and saw up the trees, so he had lumber to build a house or buildings. And then he built a grist mill, and so there's always been a dam on 4th Street there. Of course, now it's a cement dam. The dam that's there now, I believe, was built in the 1930s or 40s. But of course, the first dam was just a earthen dam, a dirt dam. But then it was replaced with a cement. So he is quite wealthy. And when he heard the railroad was coming to this area, the Milwaukee, Mississippi Railroad, there's a community just south of Stoughton, about 4 miles, it was called Dunkirk Falls, and now it's just called Dunkirk. There is a power plant there on the river, and that's where the Dunkirk Town Hall is, but it was called Dunkirk Falls. They had a general store, post office, and there's a fellow by the name of Mr. Lyons, and he offered to sell property to the Milwaukee, Mississippi Railroad if they would come through Dunkirk Falls. Well, Luke Stone heard about that, so he went to the railroad, and he went one better. He donated the property for the railroad. So that's how the railroad came through Stoughton. And if you go just follow the tracks, and just on the southeast side of Stoughton, the railroad tracks takes a bend a little more to the east and heads to Edgerton and misses Dunkirk Falls, which is just down the road from there. But the tracks were laid in the late fall of 1853, and passenger and freight service started in December of 1853 between Milwaukee and Stoughton. Then in the spring of 54, the tracks was laid to Madison. So we had railroad service before Madison did. And we'll move on. Oh, before I move too far, here we got called trench art. It's a mortar shell, the casing, and they made a design on it. You can cut the top a little bit, little design. And that's from World War II. During World War I, there was a lot of carving done in the trenches, and that was also called trench art. We don't have any of that available. I wish we did. And we'll move on here, and we got a military foot locker here. This is what you would keep your clothes in and supplies during training. Then there's a insurance agent called his name was Walt Eggleston. This would be the military plaque that would go on your gravestone. And the family didn't want it on his gravestone, so they donated it to the Stoughton Historical Society. But he was a staff sergeant in the 378th Infantry, 95th Infantry Division during World War II. He passed away in 1969. And I mentioned before we came in, the museum here across the street was Sons of Norway Lodge. It was a Norwegian Methodist church, and this is one of what the ushers would use to collect the donations from the visitors in the pews. The ushers would stand in the aisle and just pass this down, and you'd deposit your donation in the box here. And we also have one from the what church is it? First Lutheran Church, which is up by River Bluff School now on Washington Street. This is what First Lutheran used to use. And the First Lutheran Church originally was located on the corner of 6th Street and Jefferson Street. There's a parking lot there now. But the church burned in 1944, I believe it was. They had church service that morning, and that afternoon the church started on fire, and it was a total loss. They figured it started up in the balcony near the electric organ. And again, we got some late 1800, early 1900 dresses here. And also up alongside the window, there's a red candle, and that's the candle holder from First Lutheran Church before it burned. That's what they used for lighting before electricity. Would be a candle holder with a candle in it, of course. In here, we got our music room. We got some music on the piano there. It was written by W.W.C. Wright, who was the father of Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous architect from Spring Green, Wisconsin, in Taliesin Architect School. But Frank Lloyd Wright's father wrote the music on the piano. Above the piano on the left side, we got a picture of Ethel Qualheim. She was a resident in Stoughton here. She just passed away maybe 2 or 3 years ago. She was nationally known rosemaler, and she learned how to rosemall from Per Listney, the fellow that was the pinstriper at the wagon works. As a child, she lived nearby, and she would walk over and watch Per rosemall in his garage. And of course, at that time, there weren't any classes or any books of how to rosemall. So once she learned how to do it, she wrote many books of how to rosemall and taught classes on it. She also painted the clock next to it and the picture next to it. And every year, the Wisconsin State Rosemalling Association for Syttende Mai, our Norwegian 17th of May celebration, a member of the State Rosemalling Association rosemalls an item to be raffled off to raise funds for the association. And in the 1970s, Ethel rosemalled this hutch. And a family from Illinois won it, and they didn't appreciate it. They didn't want it, so they gave it to some friends of theirs here in Stoughton. And after a few years, they didn't want it anymore. So the family notified me to see if we wanted it at the museum, and of course we jumped at the chance of getting it because it's so beautiful. The items on the hutch are rosemalled by local rosemallers. The center bowl was rosemalled by my mother, B. Kalland. She passed away in 1993, but she was a rosemaller. And rosemalling, they make their own patterns depending on what they're painting, whether it's a hutch like this or a smaller bowl like this, or a large one like this one that Ethel painted. They make their own patterns, and they decide what colors to use and where to use them. But there's writing on the inside edge here in Norwegian, and the writing is, "Good food and good friends go well together," and this is rosemalled in 1979 by my mother. And Ann Nelson rosemalled this plate. That's Dr. David Nelson's wife, and Jean Quam. And here's hot plate showing Ethel Klein with two young girls. That's for sale at different places. I've seen them in South Dakota even. But on here it says Ethel received a gold medal from Vesterheim Museum in 1969, which is in Decorah, Iowa. And also the King of Norway granted Ethel the St. Olaf Medal of Honor in 1971. In 1989, she was flown to Washington, D.C. to receive the most prestigious arts honor in the United States, the National Endowment of the Arts Award. So she was, like I said, she was very famous and talented. And on the floor we got a hand organ, and to operate it you got to turn the crank, and the cylinder rotates and hits the keys. But this is from the late 1800s, and there's little pins on the cylinder. And for the life of me, I have no idea how they figured out where to stick the pins in the cylinder to hit the keys at the right time to make music. There's quite a talent. I'm sure it's very frustrating. Nowadays, when anything's made, it's on the computer. You don't have to think much about it. But this, they had to think about it. And again, here's a picture of when this was a church. Has some flowers there, and got the three big chairs like I mentioned back there. And this table right beside me in the church pews. That's when it was a church. And of course the light hanging from the ceiling. And on the floor we got what's called a samotikin. It's a string instrument. It's supposed to be one of the easiest instruments to learn how to play. And you play it with a bow just like a violin. And this is a one-string instrument. And over there on the table, I think there's about a 4-string or 6-string samotikin on the table. And in Stoughton, we got, at the high school, we got a dance group called the Stoughton Norwegian Dancers. And they were started in 1953 by Jean Reek. She was a Phi-Ed teacher at the high school. And she was approached by the superintendent of the high school one day if she wanted to keep her teaching job, she had to start a dance group. He didn't care what kind. So Jean went to Norway, Denmark, Sweden, took 8mm films and took notes of their traditional dances. And she decided as long as Stoughton is a Norwegian community, there should be Norwegian dancing. So she started the Norwegian Dancers in 1953. And this is her bunad that she wore at every performance until she retired. And they go throughout the U.S. in the summer performing, and they even go to Norway and perform. They were just there this past June in 2015. And the first bunad that the girls of the Norwegian Dancers wore is that yellow one in the back corner. That's the first one that they wore. Now they wear quite fancy ones, like similar to this one. This one was made by Marion Kibo, who was a Stoughton native. And she also made this one. This is a Stoughton bunad. In Norway, each area has their own style of bunad, so she thought Stoughton needed their own style. So she made this one as a Stoughton bunad. But look at the fancy beadwork on the chest plate of that one. I'm not sure what area that's from. I'm not sure where it's from. But then we got another bunat here, and the bunats are worn for special occasions, for weddings or anniversaries. And the men, they also wear fancy attire that's also called bunat. So whether you're man or woman, they're both called bunats. And over here on the wall, we got a picture of Luke Stoughton, the founder of Stoughton. And he kind of looks like Abraham Lincoln, and his wife is next to him, Eliza Page. And those paintings are on ticking, called bed ticking, that they would make mattresses and pillows out of years ago. But he was the founder of Stoughton, and they had 4 daughters. They had Eldora, Ellen, Delete, and Luella. Their 4 pictures are down in the far corner. Eldora passed away at age 4 from common causes. And they're all buried just down the street here at Riverside Cemetery. If you go turn off of Page Street onto Center Drive into the cemetery, it'd be right on your left on the highest knoll in the cemetery. It's a tall white pillar type of monument there. And he's buried on the highest point in the cemetery. That way you can look across the mill pond at the village that he developed. And in the display case are artifacts from Luke Stoughton or his family. He was a Shriner, got the Zor Fest there, and got an old camera in there and not a mustache, but a cup, shaving cup in the case there, and got a violin or fiddle and an old watch. And before I get too far, I'll mention the writing desk and the chair that Per Lisney painted in the 1930s. We just acquired that this summer. A fella who lived in South Carolina contacted us, said he had it. His mother was given it from Per Lisney when they lived near Per Lisney. And he also said that if you watched Per paint, you couldn't say anything, otherwise he'd kick you out. So I've heard it from 2 different sources, so it must be true. And up here we got another display case with wood carving in it, hand wood carving. This wooden mug is called a tankard, and it's from 1645, that wooden tankard. And we got some wooden spoons, and there's a wooden chain here carved from one piece of wood, and there's a cylinder with 3 little balls in it. And that's a wedding chain. On the end of it's supposed to be a spoon on each end. And the tradition is when you get married, the bride and groom would put that chain around their necks. And it's a short chain, so you'd have, if you want to take a bite of your food, you'd have to take turns. So you'd have to pull it your way so you could take a bite. Then the new bride would have to pull it her way and take a bite. And I guess that's a good way of learning to give and take and share. On the top of the display cases is what's called tinas. They are Norwegian lunch boxes. When the Norwegians would take their cattle up into the mountains to graze, they would carry a tina with their lunch in it. And here's what's called an ale bowl. You would put the ale in here, and you would drink it like this. Take a hold of both sides and drink it. And we have some more rose mauling. Again, these 2 are from Sigmund Arseth. He's from Norway, and he comes periodically to teach rose mauling in Stoughton. And again, this is by Per Lisney. And these 2 are by local artists. This is Barb Morgan, and this is Vi Thody. They're all from Stoughton area. So sometime you come to the museum, you can take a closer look at the wood carvings there. There's a little trunk underneath the display case with a rounded top. And over here we got some quilts, handmade quilts. Of course, there wasn't any heat or very little heat in the houses, so you would make, the woman of the house would make quilts so you would stay warm, somewhat warm in the wintertime. And here we have some more stone artifacts. And again, the Luke Stone and Eliza Page's daughters, Luella, Delete, Ellen, and Eldora. And here's a picture of Delete. It's Huldah Delete Stoughton, and she married Nelson Williams. But this is when she was a child, and of course this is when she got to be an older woman, or got to be an adult. In here we got a display, human hair, and when somebody passed away in the family, you'd cut a lock of their hair off and make a design out of it in remembrance of the person who passed away. So, and every year we celebrate Sitamai. We've been celebrating Sitamai since, I had King and Queen since 1969. And the first King and Queen was Esther and Odver Haug. In 1969, King and Queen. My folks were King and Queen in 1991, put in B. Kalland, but my dad passed away 4 weeks before Sitamai, so he was not able, of course, to partake. And there's a picture of them in here. Oops, in this book. Here's a picture of him. And there again you can see the men's bunat and my mother's bunat. And so after he passed away, I've been wearing his bunat every year in honor of my father, Pud. And my wife and I, Barb and I, we were selected as Sit and My King and Queen in 2010. We're the first family to have 2 generations as King and Queen. Here's the wife and I, and they also have Prince and Princess now also. And so there's a committee that chooses the King and Queen. Names are submitted, or the committee members come up with names, and it's to a local couple who promote Stoughton and volunteer and do good things for Stoughton. And it's a big surprise when you're asked to be King and Queen. Then you got to keep it, you can't tell anybody. You're usually notified in September, but you can't tell anybody until February when it's announced to the public at Norse Afternoon of Fun, where the Norwegian dancers perform. Then the public knows about it. But for Sitamai, since 1966, they've been developing Sitamai coins for collectors. It's a local thing. There used to be a fellow by the name of Art Anderson who developed the coins every year till 1992. He passed away. Then since then there's been 2 or 3 other people that design the coins. Each coin is different. On one side they have something, a picture of Stoughton, a building or whatever, and on the other side is something from Norway. And they also, for Sitamai, they have Sitamai buttons that you buy, and that gives you access to all the events. You can go to all the events that's happening in Stoughton. This is a picture of the Main Street Bridge. And when that bridge was being replaced, instead of taking it apart in pieces and throwing it away, There's a Norwegian by the name of Lars Vingham. He was a house mover, and he took this bridge and floated it from Main Street up the river against the current and used it at Fortin Street. This is the first bridge used at Fortin Street after it moved from Main Street. And again, down here we have quite a few three-legged rose-mulled chairs. They're called roundabouts. In Norway, they'd be stuck back in the corner, and when you get guests, then you would bring it out so guests would have a place to sit. And here's some more artifacts from the Stoughton family. And years ago, on the casket, when you passed away, there was a metal plate attached to the casket. The one in here is from Luke Stoughton. It says, born December 10th, 1799, and died August 15th, 1877. And so that's off his casket. And here's a picture or a map of Stoughton from 1855. And again, it shows Catfish Creek coming through Stoughton. And it does show the railroad tracks there, because the railroad came in 1853, and this is 1855, a couple years after the railroad came to town. And this picture is Luke Stoughton's father, Thomas Stoughton. We do not have a picture of his mother, but we do have one of his father. And again, here's a men's bunat. Again, I don't know what area that's from. And above the doorway here, we have a picture from showing the Good Samaritan, the biblical story of the Good Samaritan. And it was presented by the Independent Order of Odd Fellows that used to be in Stoughton. It was painted by Charles Soybe in 1885. But that's a Good Samaritan picture. I guess we've pretty much covered everything on the upstairs here. We'll go downstairs and see some more items down in the basement.